Welcome to Chosen by Love, where fate brings hearts together in the most unexpected ways. Subscribe and join our growing family of story lovers. Tell us where you're watching from, and let's begin today's journey. Dad, can I borrow $50 for baby formula? I'll pay you back Friday. Those 12 words were never meant for a billionaire. They were sent by a desperate mother who thought she was texting her father. At 11:47 p.m., rain tapped softly against the cracked window of Brielle Hart's small apartment on the edge of Columbus, Ohio. The sound blended with the low hum of an aging refrigerator and the restless cries coming from the crib in the corner of the room. Brielle stood barefoot on the worn linoleum floor, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion. She glanced toward the crib again. Her 10-month-old son, Oliver, was awake, his tiny face red from crying. She hurried over and gently lifted him into her arms. "I know, sweetheart," she whispered, rocking him slowly. "I know." His cries softened for a moment before returning. Brielle pressed her cheek against his soft blonde hair and closed her eyes. She already knew what the problem was. The formula container on the kitchen counter was empty. Not almost empty. Completely empty. She had shaken it 3 times hoping some hidden scoop would magically appear. It never did. Earlier that week, her hours at the bakery had been cut after a slow month. Rent had drained most of her checking account. The electric bill was due in 3 days. And now somehow she was standing in her kitchen with $3.17 left to her name. Oliver needed formula. Tonight. Not tomorrow morning. Not next week. Tonight. Brielle carefully laid him back into the crib and walked toward the counter. Her phone sat beside the empty formula container. The screen was cracked across one corner. A reminder of another difficult month she could never quite recover from. She opened her banking app again even though she already knew the balance. $3.17. The number looked smaller every time she saw it. Her throat tightened. She hated asking for help. She always had. But sometimes pride had to lose to necessity. She opened her messages and searched for her father's contact. Their relationship was complicated. They spoke only occasionally, usually around holidays. But $50 was not a fortune. Surely he could spare $50 for his grandson. Brielle typed slowly. "Dad, can I borrow $50 for baby formula? I'll pay you back Friday." She stared at the message. Her finger hovered over the screen. Then she hit send. Relief lasted less than 2 seconds. A small delivery notification appeared. Message sent. Brielle set the phone down and exhaled. Maybe everything would be okay. Maybe her father would answer. Maybe tonight would not become another disaster. She picked Oliver up again and carried him to the rocking chair beside the window. Outside, headlights drifted through the rain-slick parking lot below. Most people were ending their evenings. Some were probably watching television. Some were getting ready for bed. Somewhere, families were laughing over late-night snacks without worrying about whether they could afford breakfast. Brielle looked down at her son. "We'll figure it out," she promised softly. "We always do." Across town, Wyatt Holloway sat alone in a glass-walled penthouse overlooking downtown Columbus. The city lights stretched endlessly beneath him like stars scattered across the earth. A half-finished business proposal sat open on his tablet. Several executives were waiting for his decision before morning. Normally, Wyatt never ignored work. Tonight, however, his phone vibrated beside his glass of sparkling water. He barely glanced at the screen. Another message. Probably another business request. Another problem demanding his attention. But when his eyes landed on the words, something unexpected happened. He stopped reading everything else. "Dad, can I borrow $50 for baby formula? I'll pay you back Friday." Wyatt frowned. He looked at the unfamiliar number. Then he read the message again. And for reasons he could not yet explain, he suddenly found himself staring at those 12 words far longer than he should have. Wyatt Holloway had built companies worth billions of dollars, negotiated contracts across 3 continents, and made decisions that affected thousands of employees every day. Yet somehow a simple text message from a stranger refused to leave his mind. He leaned back in the leather chair overlooking the Denver skyline and read the message for a 3rd time. Then a 4th. The words were plain, almost painfully ordinary. There was no dramatic story. No attempt to manipulate. No requests for thousands of dollars. Just $50. $50 for baby formula. He glanced at the unfamiliar phone number again before setting the device down on the glass table. For several seconds he tried returning his attention to the acquisition proposal waiting on his tablet. Numbers filled the screen. Forecasts. Revenue projections. Market analyses. Normally this was the language he understood best. Tonight the figures seemed strangely distant. His eyes drifted back toward the phone. Meanwhile, in Ohio, Brielle continued rocking Oliver in the dim apartment. The little boy had finally quieted, his heavy eyelids beginning to close. She looked at her phone every few minutes, hoping to see her father's name appear. Nothing. No response. No missed call. No explanation. Just silence. Her stomach tightened with worry. Maybe he was asleep. Maybe he had not seen the message yet. Or maybe he had seen it and chosen not to answer. She hated that last possibility. Back in Columbus, Wyatt finally picked up the phone and typed a response. "I think you may have the wrong number." His thumb hovered over the screen. Then he erased the message. Something about it felt cold. Too final. He tried again. "Are you okay?" This time he pressed send. The message disappeared. A few moments later the screen remained silent. No reply arrived. Wyatt checked the time. Almost midnight in Ohio. If there really was a baby involved, the situation was probably becoming more difficult by the minute. He stood and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. Rain clouds drifted over the city lights below. For reasons he could not explain, he pictured a young mother sitting alone somewhere, worried about her child. The image felt uncomfortably real. His assistant often joked that he spent too much time solving business problems and not enough time caring about people. Maybe she was right. Yet this was ridiculous. He did not know this woman. She could be anyone. The story could be completely false. Still, something bothered him. The message had not asked for sympathy. It had not demanded anything. It carried the quiet desperation of someone who had exhausted every other option. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Wyatt glanced at the phone again. Nothing. Finally another message appeared. His heartbeat unexpectedly quickened. "I am sorry. Wrong number." That was all. No request. No follow-up. No attempt to continue the conversation. Just an apology. Wyatt stared at the screen. Most scammers did not apologize. Most desperate people did not disappear after one mistake. Yet she had. The conversation should have ended there. Instead he opened the contact profile. As the owner of a nationwide logistics company, Wyatt legally had access to public record databases that his corporate security team used to verify identities and business contacts every day. After confirming that the number belonged to a residential address in Columbus, Ohio, he hesitated for only a moment before making another decision he could not explain. The account displayed a small photo. The image was blurry, but he could make out a young woman holding a baby against her shoulder. Both were smiling. The picture looked genuine. Tired but genuine. Wyatt found himself wondering when the photo had been taken. Before financial problems? Before sleepless nights? Before whatever circumstances had pushed her to ask for help? He shook his head and laughed softly at himself. This was absurd. He was investigating a stranger because of a text message. Yet even as the thought crossed his mind, he opened another application and entered the phone number. Public information began appearing. Location. Service provider. Columbus, Ohio. The rain outside intensified, streaking the windows with silver lines. Wyatt studied the information on the screen while a strange feeling settled in his chest. It was not curiosity alone. It was concern. Genuine concern. And he could not remember the last time a complete stranger had made him feel that way. The clock on Wyatt's phone read 12:06 a.m., when he finally made a decision that made absolutely no sense from a business perspective. He closed the acquisition proposal, grabbed his keys and headed for the elevator. 10 minutes later he was walking through a 24-hour grocery store near downtown Columbus. The fluorescent lights reflected off polished floors as he pushed a cart through the nearly empty aisles. First he felt ridiculous. Then he remembered the photo of the young woman holding the baby. He stopped in front of the formula section. Rows of brightly colored containers lined the shelves. He stared at them with complete confusion. He had negotiated billion-dollar mergers, yet he had no idea which formula a baby might need. An older employee stocking products nearby noticed his expression. "First baby?" she asked with a smile. Wyatt laughed softly. "Not exactly." 5 minutes later his cart contained 2 containers of formula, a package of diapers, baby wipes, infant medicine, apples, bread, milk, soup, cereal and several other groceries he suspected might be useful. As he rolled the cart toward checkout, he felt something unfamiliar. Anticipation. Not the anticipation of closing a deal. Something far more personal. Meanwhile, Brielle sat in the rocking chair staring at the dark screen of her phone. Oliver had fallen asleep against her chest. She carefully laid him back into the crib and pulled a thin blanket over him. The apartment felt colder than usual. The rain continued tapping against the windows. Her stomach growled. She ignored it. Mothers became experts at ignoring their own needs. She opened the refrigerator. Half a carton of milk. Few eggs. A bottle of ketchup. Not much else. Tomorrow she would figure something out. Somehow she always did. She was about to turn off the kitchen light when a pair of headlights swept across the apartment wall. Brielle glanced through the blinds. A dark SUV had pulled into the parking lot. She did not think much of it. People came and went at all hours. But then, several minutes later, someone knocked on her door. Brielle froze. Nobody visited after midnight. Another knock followed. Gentle but clear. Her pulse quickened. She approached carefully and looked through the peephole. A tall man stood outside holding several grocery bags. Rain droplets glistened on his dark jacket. She did not recognize him. For a moment neither moved. Then the stranger lifted one of the bags slightly and offered an awkward smile. Brielle opened the door just a few inches. "Can I help you?" she asked cautiously. The man looked equally uncertain. "I hope so," he said. "My name is Wyatt. You accidentally sent me a text message earlier tonight." Brielle stared at him. Her mind immediately returned to the message she had sent by mistake. Her face turned crimson. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. "I am so sorry about that." Wyatt shook his head. "You do not need to apologize." He glanced toward the grocery bags. "I was worried." Brielle blinked. "You drove here because of a text message?" The question sounded absurd even to her ears. Wyatt almost laughed. "When you say it out loud, it sounds strange." For several seconds neither spoke. Then a small cry came from inside the apartment. Oliver had awakened again. Brielle's expression instantly changed. The embarrassment disappeared beneath concern. She turned toward the crib. Wyatt heard the baby crying and looked back at the grocery bags in his hands. Without thinking, he gently held one forward. "I brought formula." The words hung in the air. Brielle's eyes widened. She looked at the bags. Then at Wyatt. Then back toward her son. For a moment she seemed unable to speak. Nobody had shown up for her in a very long time. Certainly not a stranger. The rain continued falling outside as tears unexpectedly filled her eyes. She quickly looked away, embarrassed by the emotion. But Wyatt noticed. And standing in that worn apartment doorway just after midnight, surrounded by silence and rain and uncertainty, both of them felt the strange sensation that their lives had just shifted in a direction neither one could have predicted. For a few seconds neither Brielle nor Wyatt moved. The only sound came from Oliver's soft cries drifting from the crib. Then Brielle stepped aside. "You should probably come in before everything gets soaked," she said quietly. Wyatt nodded and entered the apartment, careful not to track too much rain onto the worn floor. The space was small but it was clean. A faded couch sat against one wall. Children's books were stacked neatly beside a rocking chair. The apartment showed signs of struggle, but it also showed something else. Care. Brielle immediately walked to the crib and lifted Oliver into her arms. The little boy's cries softened as she gently rocked him. Wyatt set the grocery bags on the kitchen counter and glanced around awkwardly. He suddenly felt very out of place. He was used to boardrooms, luxury hotels, and private offices. This felt more intimate than any of those places. "You really drove all the way here?" Brielle asked. Wyatt rubbed the back of his neck. "I was already heading out." The excuse sounded weak even to him. Brielle raised an eyebrow but decided not to challenge it. Her attention shifted toward the grocery bags. She carefully opened one and froze. Formula, diapers, baby wipes, fresh fruit, bread, milk, soup. Her eyes widened with every item she pulled out. "This is way more than $50, she whispered. Wyatt shrugged. "I was not exactly sure what babies need." For the first time that night, Brielle laughed. It was a tired laugh, but it was genuine. "That might be the most honest thing anyone has said to me all month." The sound caught Wyatt off guard. Something about it made the apartment feel warmer. Oliver seemed to agree because he stopped fussing and stared curiously at the stranger. Wyatt looked back at him. "So this is the guy causing all the trouble?" Oliver blinked. Then he offered a small smile. Brielle laughed again. "Congratulations. He likes you." "I feel honored," Wyatt replied. A few minutes later, Brielle prepared a bottle using the new formula. Relief washed across her face as Oliver eagerly drank. She sat in the rocking chair, watching him. For the first time all night, her shoulders relaxed. Wyatt noticed immediately. The tension that had been etched into her expression since he arrived seemed to melt away. He found himself smiling without realizing it. "Thank you," Brielle said softly. "Seriously, I do not know what I would have done tonight." Wyatt looked down at the counter. "You would have figured something out." Brielle gave him a knowing look. "Maybe, but it would not have been easy." Silence settled comfortably between them. Not awkward silence. The kind that appears when two strangers suddenly stop feeling like strangers. After a while, Wyatt noticed the kitchen light flickering overhead. Every few seconds it dimmed before brightening again. "Has that been doing that all night?" he asked. Brielle glanced up and sighed. "For about 3 weeks. Why not replace it?" She laughed softly. "Because every repair costs money." Wyatt stared at the fixture. Then he rolled up his sleeves. "Do you have a ladder?" 20 minutes later, Brielle found herself standing beside the counter holding a flashlight while Wyatt balanced on a small step stool adjusting the loose fixture. The situation felt absurd. A man she had met less than an hour ago was fixing her kitchen light at 12:45 in the morning. Yet somehow it felt natural. When the light finally stopped flickering, Brielle applauded dramatically. Wyatt bowed. "Thank you. Thank you. I will be here all week." That earned another laugh. A real one this time. The kind that reached her eyes. Wyatt noticed it immediately. He realized he had spent months surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Investors wanted returns. Executives wanted approvals. Reporters wanted interviews. Yet sitting in this tiny apartment, helping a tired mother and making a baby smile felt strangely more rewarding than anything he had done all week. Across the room, Oliver finished his bottle and drifted peacefully to sleep. Brielle carefully placed him back in the crib. When she turned around, she caught Wyatt watching the sleeping child. The expression on his face surprised her. It was not pity. It was not curiosity. It was something gentler. Something sincere. And for reasons she could not explain, that realization made her feel safe. By the time Wyatt finally left the apartment, it was nearly 2 o'clock in the morning. The rain had slowed to a light mist, and the parking lot reflected the glow of distant streetlights. He sat inside his SUV for a moment before starting the engine, looking up at the second-floor window where a faint light still shone through the blinds. It should have been a simple act of kindness, a one-time encounter that ended with groceries and a repaired light fixture. Instead, he drove back to his penthouse unable to stop thinking about Brielle and Oliver. The next morning, Brielle woke after only a few hours of sleep. For the first time in weeks, panic was not the first emotion waiting for her. The formula container on the counter was full. The refrigerator held actual groceries. Oliver greeted her with a bright smile instead of hungry tears. Standing in her tiny kitchen, she found herself staring at the bags Wyatt had brought. The entire night felt almost unreal. A stranger had appeared out of nowhere and changed the course of an impossible evening. She assumed she would never see him again. She was wrong. 3 days later, there was another knock at her door. Brielle opened it and froze. Wyatt stood there holding a small stuffed elephant. "I was driving through the neighborhood," he said. The excuse was so unconvincing that Brielle immediately laughed. "You drove through my neighborhood by accident?" Wyatt glanced toward the toy. "Maybe not completely by accident. Oliver spotted the elephant and immediately reached for it. Within seconds, the toy became his new favorite possession. That should have been the end of the visit. Instead, Wyatt stayed for coffee. A week later, he appeared again, this time carrying a toolbox. The kitchen faucet had been dripping for months. Brielle had mentioned it casually during one of their conversations. Somehow Wyatt remembered. Another week passed. He arrived with a bag of fresh pastries from a bakery across town. Brielle pointed out the irony that she worked at a bakery herself. Wyatt claimed he was conducting research. She rolled her eyes. Every visit came with a different excuse. Sometimes he wanted to check whether the repaired light still worked. Sometimes he claimed Oliver needed quality control inspections on the stuffed elephant. Sometimes he brought groceries. Sometimes he simply showed up with coffee and conversation. Slowly, a routine began to form. Brielle looked forward to hearing his knock at the door. Oliver practically bounced with excitement whenever Wyatt appeared. And Wyatt found himself rearranging meetings and delaying flights just to create opportunities to stop by. One Saturday afternoon, Brielle sat on a park bench while Oliver played nearby under her watchful eye. Wyatt sat beside her holding 2 cups of hot chocolate. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves. Families filled the playground. Children laughed from swings and climbing structures. For a while they simply watched the scene unfold. "So what exactly do you do?" Brielle finally asked. Wyatt had been carefully avoiding detailed answers for weeks. "Business," he replied. Brielle narrowed her eyes. "That is not an actual answer." "Technology and logistics," he said. Technically it was true. "Sounds important." Wyatt shrugged. "Not really." Brielle smiled. "You are terrible at talking about yourself." The comment stayed with him longer than she realized. Most people wanted details about his achievements, his companies, or his wealth. Brielle never asked those questions. She cared more about whether he had eaten lunch than how much money he earned. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, Oliver stumbled across the grass and wrapped both tiny arms around Wyatt's leg. The gesture lasted only seconds, but it caught Wyatt completely off guard. He looked down at the little boy, then at Brielle. Something shifted quietly inside him. For the first time in years, success no longer felt like the most important thing in his life. And neither of them realized that the secret Wyatt had been hiding was becoming harder to keep with every passing day. Nearly 6 weeks passed after that rainy night, and Brielle had stopped thinking of Wyatt as a stranger. He had become part of the rhythm of her life. Some evenings he stopped by after work with takeout containers balanced in his hands. Other days he spent an hour on the floor building towers from colorful blocks while Oliver happily knocked them over. The simple moments became her favorite part of the week. That was why the email arriving on a Tuesday morning felt so important. Brielle stared at the message on her phone while standing behind the bakery counter. A local nonprofit organization was hosting a large charity gala downtown. One of the event coordinators had sampled her pastries at a community fundraiser and wanted her bakery to provide desserts for the evening. It was the largest opportunity her manager had ever received. By Friday afternoon, Brielle found herself walking through the grand ballroom of the city's most luxurious hotel. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. Elegant tables stretched across the room. Staff members moved quickly between displays of flowers and decorations. She adjusted the sleeve of her simple navy dress and tried not to feel out of place. The room was filled with executives, politicians, investors, and community leaders. People who belonged in places like this. Not people like her. As she arranged dessert trays near the banquet tables, her phone buzzed. A message from Wyatt appeared. "How is the big event going?" Brielle smiled. "I feel like I accidentally walked into a movie." A response arrived seconds later. "You will do great." She laughed softly and slipped the phone into her purse. Across the ballroom, a massive screen displayed the logo of a charitable foundation. Guests continued arriving. Conversations filled the room. Brielle focused on her work, unaware that the evening was about to change everything. An hour later, the lights dimmed slightly. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage. The crowd gradually quieted. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced warmly, "thank you for joining us tonight as we celebrate innovation, leadership, and community impact." Applause filled the room. Brielle continued organizing pastries while listening from a distance. The speaker introduced several local sponsors before moving to the final name. And now, please join me in welcoming the visionary entrepreneur, whose generosity made this entire event possible. Founder and Chief Executive Officer of Holloway Global Systems, billionaire philanthropist Wyatt Holloway. The tray slipped from Brielle's hands. Fortunately, it landed on the table instead of the floor. Her heart stopped. For a second she thought she had heard the wrong name. Then the giant screens illuminated with photographs, magazine covers, business awards, corporate headquarters, interviews, news headlines. And in every image stood the same man who sat cross-legged on her apartment floor playing with Oliver's stuffed elephant. The same man who fixed her kitchen light. The same man who drank coffee in her tiny living room. Wyatt walked onto the stage as applause thundered throughout the ballroom. Brielle stared in disbelief. Her mind raced through every conversation they had shared. Every vague answer. Every time he described his job as simply business. Every moment he carefully avoided telling her the truth. On stage, Wyatt thanked donors and community partners. His voice sounded exactly the same, yet somehow completely different. The audience hung on every word. People admired him, respected him, followed him. Brielle barely heard the speech. Her pulse pounded in her ears. When the presentation ended, guests immediately surrounded Wyatt. Executives shook his hand. Reporters requested interviews. Investors approached him with smiles. It was a world she had never seen before. A world he had hidden from her. Then across the crowded ballroom, Wyatt looked up. Their eyes met. His smile appeared instantly, the familiar smile she knew so well. But the moment he saw her expression, the smile vanished. He understood immediately. Brielle knew. And standing beneath the glittering chandeliers while hundreds of people celebrated around them, Wyatt realized the secret he had protected for weeks might cost him the one relationship he never expected to find. The ballroom suddenly felt smaller than it had a few minutes earlier. Brielle could still hear the applause echoing through the room, but it sounded distant now, as though she were underwater. She turned away before Wyatt could reach her. Her hands trembled as she gathered the empty serving trays from the dessert table. Every conversation they had shared replayed in her mind. Every vague answer. Every half-truth. Every time she had asked about his work and received a careful response that revealed almost nothing. She had trusted him. That was the part that hurt. Not the money. Not the headlines. Not the private jets and corporate towers flashing across the giant screens. It was the realization that while she had shared nearly everything about her life, he had hidden the biggest truth about his. Brielle. She heard Wyatt's voice behind her. She stopped walking but did not turn around immediately. When she finally faced him, the concern in his eyes was impossible to miss. "I can explain," he said quietly. Brielle let out a small laugh that carried no humor. "Can you?" Around them, guests continued mingling, unaware of the storm unfolding between two people standing only a few feet apart. Wyatt glanced toward a quieter hallway near the ballroom entrance. "Please." After a moment, Brielle followed him. The hallway was empty except for the soft glow of wall sconces and the distant sounds of music drifting from the gala. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Brielle crossed her arms. "How long were you planning to keep pretending?" Wyatt looked down briefly. "I was not pretending. You told me you worked in business. Ido. You told me technology and logistics. That was true too." Brielle shook her head. "You know exactly what I mean." Wyatt exhaled slowly. There was no defense that would make this easier. "I never meant to lie to you." "Then why not tell me?" The question landed harder than anything else she had said. Wyatt searched for an answer. The honest answer. "Because the moment people learn who I am, everything changes." Brielle stared at him. "And you decided that for me?" He opened his mouth but found no response. She continued before he could speak. "Do you know what hurts most? It is not that you are rich. It is not that you are successful. It is that you looked at me every day and chose not to trust me with the truth." Wyatt felt every word. Because she was right. Somewhere along the way, what had started as an omission became a secret. And the longer he waited, the harder it became to tell her. "Brielle." "No." Her voice softened, but the disappointment remained. I told you about losing sleep over bills. I told you about being scared every month that something else would go wrong. You met Oliver. You sat in my apartment. You became part of our lives. Tears gathered in her eyes, though she fought them back. And all that time I never really knew who you were. Wyatt felt a heaviness settle in his chest, unlike anything he had experienced in a boardroom or business negotiation. Money could solve many problems. This was not one of them. I care about you, he said quietly. That part was always real. Brielle looked away. The words only made everything harder. Because she believed him. She believed the kindness was real. She believed the friendship was real. Maybe even something more than friendship. But trust, once shaken, was not repaired with a single conversation. After a long silence, she picked up her purse. I need some time. Wyatt took a step forward. Brielle, please. She stopped but did not turn around. I do not know what happens next, she said softly. I only know that right now I cannot do this. Then she walked away. Wyatt remained standing in the hallway long after she disappeared. Back inside the ballroom, people continued celebrating. Investors waited to speak with him. Reporters searched for interviews. Executives wanted his attention. Yet none of it mattered. For the first time in years, Wyatt Holloway felt powerless. And as he watched the ballroom doors close behind Brielle, he realized he was not afraid of losing a business deal or a fortune. He was afraid of losing her. The weeks that followed were the longest Wyatt could remember. For the first time in years, success offered no comfort. His calendar remained packed with meetings, conferences, and investor calls, yet every accomplishment felt strangely hollow. He still found himself reaching for his phone whenever something amusing happened, only to remember there was no one to text anymore. Brielle had stopped answering his messages. She was never cruel. She simply needed distance. And Wyatt respected that, even though it hurt. Across town, Brielle focused on work and on Oliver. Life moved forward because it had to. The bakery remained busy. Bills still arrived. Laundry still piled up. Toddlers still woke up before sunrise. Yet every time Oliver carried his stuffed elephant through the apartment, she thought about Wyatt. Every time she passed the repaired kitchen light, she remembered the night he stood on a step stool trying to fix it. The memories refused to disappear. One evening, Wyatt sat alone in his office staring at a screenshot on his phone. It was the message that had started everything. 12 simple words asking for $50. He had saved it months ago without really knowing why. Now he studied it again. Not as a billionaire. Not as a chief executive officer. Simply as a man whose life had changed because someone accidentally reached out for help. An idea slowly began taking shape. Over the next several weeks, Wyatt poured himself into a new project. Not a technology platform. Not a corporate acquisition. Something personal. Something meaningful. He worked closely with nonprofit leaders, family resource centers, and community organizations across the state. When reporters asked questions, he refused to discuss details. When executives wanted explanations, he simply said it was important. Then one morning invitations began appearing across Columbus. Community leaders, local families, journalists, and nonprofit organizations were invited to a special launch event. Brielle received one too. At first she planned to ignore it. Then she noticed the event title printed across the front. The $50 Promise. Something about the name caught her attention immediately. Curiosity eventually won. A week later she arrived at a renovated community center on the edge of downtown. Hundreds of people filled the building. Parents pushed strollers through bright hallways. Volunteers greeted families at information tables. Free childcare resources, emergency food assistance, parenting support programs, and financial counseling services were available throughout the facility. Brielle looked around in surprise. This was far larger than a simple charity event. It was a movement. Moments later, Wyatt stepped onto the stage. The crowd applauded, but he looked different from the man she had seen at the gala. More relaxed. More human. He adjusted the microphone and smiled nervously. Several months ago, he began. I received a text message that was never meant for me. The room grew quiet. Brielle froze. Wyatt continued. He told the entire story. Not names. Not private details. Just the truth. He described a struggling parent needing help. He described realizing how many families lived one unexpected expense away from crisis. Then he explained how the new initiative would provide emergency assistance grants of $50 to $500 for parents facing immediate needs. Formula: groceries, utility bills, transportation, the kinds of problems that could feel impossible in the wrong moment. Sometimes, Wyatt said softly, people do not need a miracle. They just need someone to show up. Brielle felt tears forming before she could stop them. On the screen behind him appeared a framed image. It was the original text message, the beginning of everything. Wyatt looked toward the audience. For a brief second, his eyes found hers. There was no pressure in his expression, no demand for forgiveness, only honesty. And for the first time since the gala, Brielle saw not the billionaire who hid the truth, but the man who had driven through the rain because a stranger needed help. Brielle remained seated long after Wyatt finished speaking. Around her, families explored the resource center, volunteers answered questions, and children laughed in nearby activity rooms. Yet her attention never fully left the man standing near the stage. For months she had focused on the fact that he kept a secret. Now, for the first time, she was seeing everything else. She remembered the rain-soaked night when he arrived carrying groceries. She remembered him sitting on her apartment floor building block towers with Oliver. She remembered the countless small acts of kindness that had never been performed for attention or recognition. They had simply been genuine. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Brielle found herself walking toward the exit. She had almost reached the doors when a familiar voice stopped her. Brielle. She turned. Wyatt stood several feet away. There was no audience now. No cameras. No executives. Just the two of them. For a moment neither spoke. Then Wyatt smiled softly. Thank you for coming. Brielle nodded. Thank you for building this. Wyatt glanced around the center. You inspired it. The statement made her look down. I only sent a text message. You changed my life, Wyatt replied quietly. The sincerity in his voice made it impossible to look away. They walked outside together. The late afternoon sun painted the city in warm shades of gold. For several minutes they simply strolled along the sidewalk in comfortable silence. Finally Brielle stopped. I was angry, she admitted. I know. And part of me still wishes you had trusted me sooner. Wyatt nodded. I wished that too. There was no excuse in his answer. No attempt to defend himself. Just honesty. Somehow that mattered. Brielle studied him for a long moment before smiling faintly. You know what confused me most? Wyatt raised an eyebrow. What? You had every reason to leave after that first night. He laughed softly. I tried. You were terrible at it. I know. For the first time in weeks they both laughed together. The tension that had separated them began to fade. Not instantly. Not magically. But enough. Over the following months, life slowly found a new rhythm. Wyatt became a permanent part of their world. He attended Oliver's first birthday party. He helped Brielle move into a brighter apartment closer to the bakery. He never tried to solve every problem with money. Instead, he showed up. Again and again. The way he always had. One spring evening nearly a year after the text message that started everything, Wyatt invited Brielle and Oliver to a small celebration marking the first anniversary of the $50 promise. Hundreds of families had received assistance. Dozens of community partnerships had been created. The program had expanded beyond Ohio and into neighboring states. As the event concluded, Wyatt asked Brielle to stay behind for a few minutes. The room gradually emptied until only the three of them remained. Oliver sat nearby hugging his beloved stuffed elephant. Wyatt reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something small. Brielle immediately recognized it. Her old cracked phone. The same one she had replaced months earlier. She stared at it in surprise. You kept that. Wyatt smiled. Open it. Confused, she pressed the power button. The screen illuminated. One message waited. Her heart began to race as she read the words. Can I borrow forever? Tears instantly filled her eyes. She looked up. Wyatt was already kneeling. Not because he was a billionaire. Not because he wanted a grand gesture. But because he loved her. The best thing that ever happened to me was a message that was never supposed to reach my phone. he said softly. You and Oliver became my family long before I realized it. Brielle Hart, will you marry me? Across the room, Oliver clapped because he sensed something wonderful was happening. Brielle laughed through her tears. Then she nodded. Only if you never ask for the $50 back. Wyatt laughed. Deal. Moments later she wrapped her arms around him as the evening sunlight poured through the windows. A year earlier she had believed her life was falling apart over a simple need she could not meet. She never imagined that one mistaken message would lead her to a man who would change everything. And as Wyatt slipped the ring onto her finger while Oliver cheered beside them, both of them understood a simple truth. Sometimes the most beautiful chapters begin with the wrong number reaching exactly the right person. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who believes in kindness, and subscribe to Chosen by Love for more unforgettable billionaire romance stories filled with hope, second chances, and life-changing moments. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to life. Thank you for being part of our amazing community.